and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Plato's Symposium was written about 2,400 years ago by somebody living in a society that was profoundly different from our own. And yet it contains a teaching that can transform the lives of all of us living today, transform them for the better, because it's aimed at a fundamental human problem, the fundamental human problem, I think, beyond bare survival. This problem, the problem of being human qua human, this sense of being divided between reason and passion, thought and feeling, if you will, mediated and immediate cognition. These things that just come to us are the things that versus the things we think through. I should tell you that my idea that Plato's Symposium is about solving this problem of psychic self-division is not really typical of modern day interpretations of the work. Most see it as being chiefly about eros, about philosophy, or about both. There's some obvious truth to these interpretations, but I think the question of the unity of the self, or soul, or personality, psyche, is really the fundamental problem that presents itself fairly early on in the dialogue. And Plato's solution of it really shapes the work. And it's really the takeaway, I think, for us. Today I'll talk about what I mean when I say this problem presents itself from early on. As I mentioned last time, the Symposium is a book that may surprise you in a number of ways. It's not a typical philosophical text, especially if we mean philosophy in its current sense. This is a story. It's a story. It's a story of a drinking party that purportedly, at least, took place in Athens about halfway through the Peloponnesian War between Athens, Sparta, and their respective allies. Actually, just before things started to go quite badly for Athens. And Plato seems to have written the dialogue several decades later. The story is that Socrates and his friends, including a couple of the most prominent people in Athens at the time, gather at the house of Agathon, a writer of tragedies, to celebrate his victory in a dramatic competition. I should tell you that one of the quirks of this dialogue is its unusual framing. Whereas the Republic, for example, is narrated directly by Socrates. It starts, "Today I went down to the Piraeus." This one is narrated by a man called Apollodorus, who says he wasn't there at this drinking party. It seems he got the scoop from someone who was there, a follower of Socrates called Aristodemus. So from the beginning, there's sort of, for some reason, Plato, and we'll talk about the possible reason later, but Plato has put us at three removes from what happened here. We have Aristodemus's account, Apollodorus's narration of it, and then finally Plato's presentation of it to us. The direction of the dialogue is set when the friends decide they're too hungover from the previous night's festivities for another night of focusing on drinking. Instead, they agree to focus on conversation, and in that typical spirit of ancient Greek admiration for oratory, Homer has this phrase, "winged words," and love of competition, they agree to each take turns speaking in praise of Eros, vying with each other to deliver the most beautiful speech. There's 7 major characters in the dialogue, or actually maybe 8, depending on how you count them. First, 4 guests plus Agathon, the host, deliver their speeches. Then Socrates, unsurprisingly, speaks last. He has the last, and we're to understand, the truest word in this contest. Or at least Plato has us thinking he's the last. As we find out later, there will be one more speaker. And then there's also a surprise in Socrates' speech itself, because it turns out that he owes the substance of it not to his own reflections, but to Diotima, a priestess he once knew, who he says taught him ta erotica, erotics, things having to do with eros. And he quotes her at great length. She's the only female major character I know of in a Platonic dialogue. And it would be strange, I think, not to consider Diotima a major character of this work. Although, note, because we're already in this sort of narrative Russian doll, having Socrates quote her puts this core of what's at the symposium, this core of erotic teaching, now at 4 removes from us, because Socrates is narrating it to the party. Aristodemus narrates it to Apollodorus. Apollodorus narrates it to his companion, and then Plato presents it all to us. Anyway, the truly last speech happens when there's an intrusion by a drunken Alcibiades, the Athenian politician and war leader, who ends up giving what's in some ways the most remarkable one of them all. Most remarkable speech of them all. Finally, there's another intrusion, this one by a seemingly random group of party crashers, and this one causes the guests to break their promise of not drinking to excess that night. Suddenly, a large crowd of revelers came to the door, and finding it open, someone had gone out, they walked straight in among the guests and lay down, and everything was full of commotion, and everybody was compelled, but no longer with any order, to drink a great deal of wine. Aristodemus, who you might remember is the follower of Socrates who was present at the party, says he then passed out and was awakened in the early morning by the sound of crowing roosters. At this point, all the other guests, he said, were either asleep or had left, except Agathon, the comic poet Aristophanes, and of course, Socrates, were still arguing and still drinking out of a large container of wine, he says. Socrates was compelling them to agree that the same man should know how to make comedy and tragedy, and that he who is by art a tragic poet is also a comic poet. They were compelled to admit this, though they were not following too well and were nodding. By the way, do you know that Woody Allen movie, Melinda, Melinda? It came out, I think, around 2008. I think Plato's Symposium must surely have been the inspiration behind it. The premise is a set of writer friends philosophizing over a meal, and the question arises whether life is naturally comic or tragic. One of the friends writes tragedy and the other comedy, and they tell the same story, one tragically and the other comedically. And so we have at the end the same playwright, Woody Allen, or writer of a movie script, writing a work both comic and tragic. Anyway, getting back to the dialogue itself, I think this point that Socrates is arguing with the last holdouts at the end actually is an important hint about this dialogue itself, because it's undeniably both comic and serious. I think the comic is on display fairly obviously here, and I've kind of touched on it already, I think. There's this theme of drunkenness, which we humans tend to find funny. I'm thinking, for example, in addition to some of the bits that I've mentioned to you, Alcibiades, who's already drunk enough when he arrives to need to be supported by his attendants, filling himself a half-gallon flagon of wine and draining it in a single swig. There's this alcohol-inspired oversharing of his ridiculous attempts in the past to seduce Socrates. There's the frequent flirtation between several of the guests, and I think there's something inherent about flirtation that also tends to border on the ridiculous, as we see, for example, with the cheesy pickup line, where it threatens to become ridiculous. We've got puns in this dialogue. For example, this phrase used at one point, pausaniou de pausamenu, which luckily enough translates into English. Pausanias paused. Socrates could be punning when he says, and I mentioned this in an earlier episode, near the beginning, all he claims to know about is ta erotica. The scholar C.D.C. Reeve, that I mentioned last time, says he could have a double meaning here, calling to mind the Greek verb ereo, to ask questions, certainly the definitive Socratic activity. And we have a physician here, one of the speakers, with the absurd name Eryximachus, which translates as burp fighter. He may have been a real person. He actually does figure in a couple other serious Platonic dialogues. But his name is indisputably absurd. And at one point, he actually advises Aristophanes, at one point in the Symposium, advises Aristophanes on how to quell an attack of hiccups that had prevented him from giving his speech. All that said, I think surely this isn't all supposed to be jest. There's deep seriousness here. There's deep pathos in it also. And I think it prompts in us, on some level of consciousness, a deep anxiety. It works to open up a rift inside of us, a troubling question, whether it's conscious or not. And that question, I think, is what the dialogue is fundamentally about. That's because praise of eros leaves certain logical possibilities. Either the reasoning behind this praise of eros will be bad, and they simply won't be convincing. Maybe good for a laugh, but nothing to really take home. Or else their praise will be convincing. But the implication of praise of any human impulse is surely that we should all follow that impulse more. So if it's convincing, then the takeaway is that we should all give in more to our erotic impulses. In a way, what I'm saying here is that in addition to the coexistence of the comic and the serious, side by side in this dialogue, interwoven, there's a parallel set of opposites at work, I think. The drunk and the sober, the intoxicated and the self-controlled. I think a typical human response to this idea of praise of eros involves two moments, which may take place on varied levels of consciousness. I think to most of us, there's going to be first an immediate appeal to this idea of eros being praised. There seems to be an element in the psyche that we've talked about a lot on this episode that craves oneness and a loss of self-control. This is the intoxicated side, and that element or tendency, the Dionysian, if you will, I think, sort of automatically open up to praise of the erotic. And indeed, what if life was so simple? What if all we had to do to live well was just to surrender to our impulses, just lose ourselves in them? Wouldn't that be a kind of paradise, a return to Eden? All this inner turmoil, which I've called the fundamental problem of being human, I've talked about so much in this series, would just disappear. Part of being human is to sense the pull of this. But sobriety and control are also part of being human. And so there's a second moment in us, I think, that opposes this one. It's foreshadowed early on in this dialogue. Socrates arrives late, and when he does, Agathon asks him to sit beside him so he can benefit from his wisdom. But Socrates replies, how nice it would be if only wisdom could flow between people, just from mere contact. And I think his words here get at the fundamental problem behind this intoxication with eros and this unbridled praise of it. I mean, we may complain about sexual repression. It's sort of part of our culture since Freud, and then especially since the 60s in the West. But when it comes down to it, we tend to want it for many reasons, the most important of which I think is that over time we learn that self-abandon does, or at least can in various ways, lead to bad choices and regret. And we learn to be anxious around this thought of this loss of self-control. A reasonably ordered life, one where we can have goals that make sense, seems, seems to presuppose a certain amount of repression. And a reasonably happy life seems to presuppose one that has goals that are attainable. And so this kind of drives us down the middle. We all crave to lose ourselves, but we also want order and control, predictability and meaningfulness. And so despite the licentiousness, and also despite the licentiousness we saw with the Bacchantes, it seems the Greek felt similarly about this Dionysian side. In fact, I think that could be precisely why they, in a way, isolated it from everyday life by putting it in a festival and closing it in a festival outside of regular time. The same goes for all the other irrational or seemingly irrational desires we repress every day. And Plato felt this also. It seems impossible to give them more space without opening up an even deeper rift in the self between our desire for ecstatic oneness and our desire for control. Tell me this, Socrates asks at one point in the Republic. Can there be any communion between soberness, the Greek word you may know is sophrosune, it's also often translated as moderation, and extravagant pleasure? How could there be, Glaucon says, since such pleasure puts a man beside himself, no less than pain? Or between it and virtue generally, Socrates asks. By no means, Glaucon replies. But is there between pleasure and insolence and license? Most assuredly. Do you know, Socrates asks, of greater or keener pleasure than that associated with Aphrodite? And Glaucon replies, I don't, nor yet of any more insane. And the Greek word is manikoteran, from mania. No more manic pleasure. So yeah, this is what I think of the premise of Plato's Symposium. On the one hand, these speeches in praise of Eros are fun and games. And yet on the other, you can't really listen to them without feeling sort of unsettled. They work on you in such a way that you become or can become more aware of your own self-dividedness in the form of these contrary reactions to them. How do we deal with our impulses? And what does it mean to have them? Are we then divided between two parts, one of which seeks joyful abandon, the other truth and self-control, and the attainment of goals? If so, are we fated to be at war with ourselves? And if so, isn't that a kind of hopeless vision of life? This possibility was certainly a concern of Plato. We saw in the Republic, for example, how he divides the psyche up into rational and irrational parts. And in another dialogue, the Phaedrus, Socrates says, we must realize that each of us is ruled by two principles which we follow wherever they lead. One is our inborn desire for pleasures. The other is our acquired judgment that pursues what is best. Sometimes these two are in agreement, but there are times when they quarrel inside us, and then sometimes one of them gains control, sometimes the other. Later in the same dialogue, he uses the analogy of a chariot drawn by one unruly and one moderate horse to convey the same idea. And he jokingly calls to mind this serious and profound problem in human living. Because of these horses of the psyche, he says, quote, chariot driving in us is inevitably a painfully difficult business. So This is the problem of Plato's Symposium. How do we humans hope to drive a chariot like this? It may seem as though Plato does not see a lot of hope here, as though, as we mentioned a couple of episodes ago, he believes that the psyche is fated to be always torn by these conflicting tendencies, perhaps even to the point of despair. And yet, this isn't Plato's final word on the subject. Oi pratomen, we shall fare well, are the very last words of the Republic. And we also saw last time, he hints toward the end of this book, that in some deeply mysterious way, the psyche has a unity beyond or below, more fundamental than this apparent division. And he seems to imply this at the beginning of the Phaedrus too. And Socrates rejects, as something of a waste of time, an attempt to find scientific explanations for mythological events. Socrates says, I have no time for such things. And the reason, my friend, is this. I'm still unable, as the Delphic inscription orders, to know myself. And it really seems to me ridiculous to look into other things before I have understood that. This is why I did not concern myself with them. I look not into them, but into my own self. Am I a beast more complicated and savage than Typhon? That's a 100-headed monster in Greek myth. Or am I a tamer, simpler animal with a share in a divine and gentle nature? I think Plato ultimately argues for the latter alternative, and to convey that deeply hopeful possibility is the main purpose of his Symposium. I'll be talking a lot about this in upcoming episodes. For now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.